May 27, 1940. The beaches east of Dunkirk, northern France. A gray dawn pushes through low clouds as thousands of men stand in the surf, motionless except for the shiver of cold. German artillery thuds in the distance, sending plumes of sand into the air. Stuka dive bombers scream down from the clouds, their sirens wailing, splintering the shallows with explosions. And yet, through field glasses, German infantry see something they did not expect from the British. The lines do not dissolve. From the German positions among the dunes and ruined villages, the scene looks almost unreal. Columns of British and French soldiers, many without helmets, stand waist-deep in the freezing channel, waiting for boats that may or may not return. When the bombs fall close, the men duck, disappear in spray and smoke. Then, as the water settles, they rise again, step back into line, and wait in the same quiet order as before. For months, Wehrmacht troops had been told what to expect from Britain. Nazi propaganda had painted the island as soft, wealthy, and decadent. The British, they were told, had lost the will for hard fighting. The real enemies, the Germans believed, would be found elsewhere, in the French army that had bled so heavily in the First World War, and in the vast future struggle in the East. But here, on the edge of the Channel, the picture does not match the script. The British Expeditionary Force is cornered. The French front has collapsed. Panzer divisions of Army Group A have sliced through Belgium and northern France faster than even their own commanders expected. In theory, this should be the clean end of Britain's army in Europe. A trapped force, short of ammunition, pressed against the sea. Instead of mass surrender or chaos, German soldiers watch a kind of disciplined defiance. Small craft dart in and out of the smoke, ferrying men to larger ships beyond the horizon line. Rearguard units inland are still fighting, buying time they know they will never use themselves. Among German officers observing the scene, something begins to shift. The British are beaten in the field, yet they are not behaving like a beaten army. That dissonance will grow over the next 5 years, as the Wehrmacht repeatedly confronts qualities in British soldiers it had not planned for and did not fully understand. In the weeks leading up to Dunkirk, almost every major assumption the Wehrmacht held about British soldiers had been reinforced by official doctrine. German training manuals and briefings summarized the British Army as slow to mobilize, conservative in its methods, and dependent on material comfort. Officers were told that British troops would avoid close-quarter combat and would collapse once artillery and armor broke their lines. The real danger, they believed, lay in French heavy formations, not in the small professional force Britain had sent across the Channel. Then came the retreat. As German armored spearheads drove to the sea, scattered British units were ordered to hold road junctions, canals, and towns to delay the advance. Many of these rearguard positions had no realistic prospect of relief. Yet German reports from May 1940 show something that did not fit the stereotype. Stubborn local resistance that cost time and casualties. At Arras on May 21st, a small British armored counterattack, roughly 70 tanks supported by infantry, hit the flank of the German advance. In pure numbers, it was insignificant compared to the scale of the campaign. But for several hours it created real alarm. Commanders, including Erwin Rommel, briefly believed they were facing a major offensive. The shock was not in the size of the force, but in the fact that the British, already in retreat, were attacking at all. Further up the coast, at places like Calais and Boulogne, German infantry battalions found themselves engaged in hard, close fighting against British and French garrisons ordered to hold to the last possible moment. Clearing these ports took longer than German planners had scheduled. Street fighting, house-to-house resistance, and repeated local counterattacks delayed precious panzer divisions that were meant to push on to Dunkirk. Letters from German officers and NCOs written home after these engagements describe surprise at how long isolated British companies and battalions continued to fight. Positions that, by German standards, were tactically hopeless were defended until ammunition was nearly gone. The assumption that British troops would break quickly under pressure began to look questionable. When the halt order paused the panzer advance near Dunkirk, German frontline units watched the evacuation develop with a mixture of frustration and uneasy respect. They had won the campaign in France with remarkable speed. They had forced a great power off the continent. And yet, watching those disciplined lines of soldiers wade out to sea under fire, it was clear that something about Britain's fighting spirit had been misjudged. That misjudgment would follow the Wehrmacht from the beaches of northern France to a very different theater, the deserts of North Africa, where German and British soldiers would confront each other again, this time at close quarters. The deserts of Cyrenaica, early 1941. Only months after Dunkirk, German troops of the newly formed Afrika Korps disembarked at Tripoli and began moving east. Many of them carried into the desert the same expectations formed in France, that British soldiers, once heavily pressured, would give way. Initial reports from Italy, whose forces had suffered serious defeats during Operation Compass, seemed to confirm the idea that British success had come against a weak opponent. Rommel's first clashes with British units in North Africa quickly complicated that picture. In the spring of 1941, German armored formations drove the British back across Libya with a speed that impressed even their own staff officers. Yet, as in France, the advance was repeatedly checked not by large, coordinated offensives, but by small, tenacious stands. At key road junctions, escarpments, and passes, British and Commonwealth troops dug in and fought until they were overrun or ordered to withdraw. The siege of Tobruk became the clearest symbol of this unexpected resilience. When Rommel's advance bypassed the port in April 1941, a garrison of mainly Australian, with British and other Allied troops, dug in behind a ring of fortifications first built by the Italians. German commanders assumed the isolated position would fall quickly. Instead, Tobruk held out for 241 days. German after-action reports describe repeated assaults broken up by well-sighted artillery and stubborn infantry defense. Infantry and tanks that had advanced rapidly across open desert now faced minefields, trenches, and determined fire from troops who understood that surrender would hand the Axis a critical supply base. German and Italian casualties mounted with each failed attack. The besiegers began to refer, half in irritation and half in respect, to the rats inside the perimeter who refused to be starved or bombed into submission. Rommel's private writings and those of his staff officers began to distinguish sharply between British soldiers and their commanders. The individual British and Commonwealth infantryman, particularly in defensive positions, was described as courageous, disciplined, and unwilling to yield ground easily. What the Germans had not expected was the combination of professional competence and a dogged refusal to admit defeat even when tactically encircled. By late 1941, German intelligence summaries acknowledged that British troops in North Africa, especially seasoned units like the Desert Rats of the 7th Armored Division, were becoming increasingly dangerous opponents. The narrative of a soft, unmilitary island people no longer matched the hard reality of repeated, costly engagements in the sand. Yet another surprise still awaited the Wehrmacht, this time not in set-piece battles, but in small, surgical strikes deep behind the lines. The first of those strikes came not in the desert, but along the rocky coasts of occupied Europe. In June 1940, within weeks of Dunkirk, Winston Churchill ordered the creation of specially trained troops of the Hunter class, soon known simply as Commandos. At first their operations were small. Pinprick raids on the Norwegian and French coasts, demolition of fish oil factories, destruction of isolated outposts. Militarily, many of these early actions had limited strategic impact. Psychologically, particularly for German garrisons who had believed themselves secure behind the Atlantic coast defenses, they were deeply unsettling. Reports from outlying units in Norway and western France began mentioning sudden night attacks by small, heavily armed British parties who disappeared before regular forces could react. The attackers were often heavily outnumbered, but moved with speed and aggression that did not fit German preconceptions of British caution. Captured orders and interrogations showed that these raiders had been instructed not just to strike targets, but to signal to the occupied populations that Britain still intended to carry the war to the continent. In North Africa, the pattern repeated in a different form. The Long-Range Desert Group, formed in 1940 by officers with pre-war desert exploration experience, began operating hundreds of kilometers behind Axis lines. They navigated through what German and Italian troops regarded as impassable terrain, bringing back detailed intelligence on supply routes, airfields, and defensive positions. Soon they were transporting an even more disruptive force, the Special Air Service. The SAS, established in 1941 under David Stirling, specialized in deep penetration raids on airfields and depots. Small groups of men, often no more than 4 or 6, slipped into Axis facilities at night, planting explosives on aircraft lined up wingtip to wingtip. On several occasions, dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground in a single raid, losses far out of proportion to the size of the raiding party. For German commanders schooled in conventional operations, this style of warfare was an unpleasant surprise. Rear areas, previously considered relatively safe, now required strong guards, patrols, and static defenses. Units that could have been used at the front were diverted to protect supply lines and installations. When British Commandos destroyed the dry dock at St. Nazaire in March 1942, removing the only Atlantic facility capable of repairing Germany's largest battleships, the message to the Wehrmacht was unavoidable. British forces were capable of bold, meticulously planned, high-risk operations far behind German lines. Hitler's response, the Commando Order of October 1942, which instructed that captured raiders be executed, reflected how seriously these small units were taken. It also confirmed something the Wehrmacht had not expected, that British soldiers would repeatedly volunteer for missions where capture could mean summary death, and would continue to do so despite the risks. From the German perspective, these raiding forces added a new and unwelcome dimension to an opponent they already found stubborn in defense. Soon, on the main European battlefield, they would discover how much the regular British Army had also changed. When British and Canadian troops returned to France in June 1944, they did so as part of an Allied force very different from the one that had been driven to Dunkirk 4 years earlier. In German planning, however, many older assumptions remained. The British senior officers believed were still cautious attackers who preferred limited offensives and would avoid the kind of large, risky landings now required. Earlier failures, such as the costly Dieppe raid in August 1942, seemed to confirm that view. The landings in Normandy forced a revision. On June 6, 1944, German units manning the Atlantic coast batteries watched as an armada of landing craft approached Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. For the troops of the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS defending that sector, the scale of the assault and the coordination between sea, air, and land exceeded expectations. Pre-invasion bombardment from hundreds of naval guns, followed by waves of aircraft, systematically struck strong points, communication lines, and assembly areas. Where defenses survived, they often found themselves facing not disorganized attackers, but units that quickly reformed under fire and pushed inland according to pre-learned plans. Over the following weeks, the fighting around Caen and along the eastern sector of the Normandy front reinforced the sense that the British Army had become a different instrument. German accounts from divisions such as the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzerlehr Division describe repeated British and Canadian attacks characterized by heavy artillery preparation, careful use of armor, and a reluctance to engage in unsupported rushes. The tempo sometimes frustrated German commanders. They judged British operations as methodical to the point of slowness. Yet that same methodical approach made British gains hard to reverse. Where German doctrine emphasized rapid maneuver, British forces in Normandy relied on firepower and endurance. Once they had established a position, dislodging them demanded significant effort. Artillery and the feared fighter bombers, the J-bows that German soldiers learned to dread, punished any daylight movement. German counterattacks, even when launched by experienced panzer units, were repeatedly broken up before they could reach their objectives. From the perspective of frontline troops, what was most striking was not simply Allied numerical superiority, but the way British and Commonwealth units had learned to integrate infantry, armor, artillery, and air support into a single grinding system. The Wehrmacht had not expected Britain, a country they had forced out of Europe in 1940, to return with an army capable of sustaining such a prolonged, resource-intensive campaign against some of Germany's best remaining formations. As the Normandy front slowly bent and then broke under that pressure, German officers and soldiers alike were forced to reassess what British determination and industrial strength, combined, could achieve. As German units fell back from France toward the Reich in late 1944, another unexpected British characteristic became critical: their treatment of prisoners. Veterans who had served on both fronts understood the difference. In the East, Capture by the Red Army often meant disappearance into a system of camps from which many never returned. In the West, by contrast, the majority of German soldiers who surrendered to British or Commonwealth forces survived the war. They were interrogated, sometimes sternly, but generally fed, housed, and processed within the framework of the Geneva Convention. This was not sentimentality. It was policy and discipline. Yet for men who had internalized years of propaganda about plutocratic decadence, the consistency of British adherence to the laws of war was, in itself, surprising. It created a stark contrast with the ideological brutality of the Eastern Front and reinforced an image of the British soldier as a tough but essentially professional opponent. By 1945, entire German formations were trying to reach British or American lines in order to surrender, a pattern Allied and German records alike make clear. After the war, in memoirs, letters, and especially in the secretly recorded conversations studied by historians such as Sönke Neitzel, German officers repeatedly returned to the same themes. They admitted that they had underestimated British political will in 1940, assuming that the fall of France would force London to make peace. They had not expected Britain to endure years of bombing, a costly U-boat campaign at sea, defeats in Greece and Crete, and still rebuild an army capable of sustained offensive operations in North Africa, Italy, and ultimately Northwest Europe. Nor had they expected the combination of qualities displayed by British and Commonwealth troops. Stubborn defense at places like Tobruk and in the Normandy bocage, the daring of commandos and special forces willing to accept extreme risks, the grinding application of artillery and air power, and a generally restrained conduct toward prisoners and civilians compared with the horrors unfolding in the East. When many former Wehrmacht officers were asked, decades later, which opponent they respected most, the British soldier was often high on the list. From the beaches of Dunkirk to the ruins of German cities in 1945, what the Wehrmacht had never anticipated was that Britain's supposedly soft soldiers would prove so hard to break, so persistent in returning to the fight, and so consistent in fighting within limits even as the war turned against Germany. It is that mixture of endurance, professionalism, and restraint that left a lasting impression on those who faced them. If you found this story worth your time, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps bring more carefully researched history to a wider audience and ensures that the experiences of those who fought and endured in the Second World War are not forgotten.